A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
And a conversation coming over this next hour. I think we're going to want to have a frank conversation about healthy pastors and thriving churches. And very shortly, we'll invite you to join into our conversation. You might have your own insight to offer around the topic that we'll talk about. I think it's largely going to be a great conversation, so get ready for some good things. We're turning our attention to healthy expressions of the local church. What does that mean? And how do whole churches become emotionally healthy and strong? Well, our special guest today says if our churches have healthy pastors, the church itself will be healthy and will thrive. Our guest is the Reverend Dr. Brian Birkett, who has a long-standing reputation as an academic and in pastoral ministry to the body of Christ here in Australia and all around the world. Well, Brian Birkett's latest book is called Healthy Pastors, Thriving Churches, Practical Principles to Fruitful Ministry for a Lifetime. Brian's the founder of Springboard Consulting, empowering people for purpose. Brian Birkett, let me say a special welcome along to 2020.
Thanks, Neil. So good to be with you and with the listeners.
Hey, Brian, we're going to be talking about healthy pastors, healthy and thriving churches, but no doubt we'll be talking about what an unhealthy pastor looks like and unhealthy and not so thriving churches. I wonder whether you've got a thought or two about how we'll be approaching these sorts of issues, because I don't want to be sort of beating up on pastors, beating up on churches, but in order to talk about the good things, you've got to identify the bad, haven't you?
Oh, look, so true, Neil. Unfortunately, there's many different challenges facing pastors and churches. And so the book primarily focuses on the needs of having a healthy pastor, but also recognizes you could be a healthy pastor and go into an unhealthy church, and you could end up a pretty unhealthy pastor, if you've tracked what I was saying there. So absolutely. But I want to say the heart for writing this book and the heart for this discussion is a love for pastors and a love for the church.
And, you know, not everyone listening is a pastor or even aspires to be, and some are not even giving a second thought for pastors because sometimes we're just pew sitters, members of a local church, and we've got our own thoughts about whether our church looks healthy or whether it looks unhealthy, whether there's some vulnerabilities in there. So I imagine that when we're hearing from people today too, they might be reflecting on our church and what it looks like. Is there some sort of a way that you encourage people to do a quick, assessment, a self-assessment about your own role in church or whether your church feels or looks healthy to you? Is there some evaluation you can do as we get a conversation like this underway?
Yeah, look, I think as people talk, this is not a conversation just for pastors, because pastors lead churches, but churches have people, thankfully, and the more people sometimes the better, and the less people sometimes the better. But either way, we're talking to the people in the churches. We're talking to the board members. We're talking to the leaders. We're talking to the pew sitter. We're talking to the person that wanders in and wonders, will this be a loving community? And that is all affected, I believe, both by the pastor, but also by how the church goes. So in answer to your question directly, though, is there a way to assess how healthy your church is? I think there's a number of ways that I would offer for that. And would you like me to respond to some of those ways? Or
well, we can get into those as the conversation builds. Let's just we'll put those on hold for a moment, because we'll talk about good principles, and even in these next few minutes. But I do want to touch on those vulnerabilities and what the unhealthy church might look like. The thoughts of no community, no relationship building, no compassion, there's no prayer in my church. I mean, are these the sorts of symptoms you might say are of an unhealthy church?
Yes, and no love and no welcoming and clicks for community, so that when a person walks in, if they stand somewhere, no one comes along to greet them. maybe a professional greeter does, but that's about it. A place where the worship doesn't connect for the person, a place where the message is not meaningful. Sometimes our pastors aren't using scripture. They're just sharing their thoughts from life. Well, life's great, but is the Bible being used also in our churches? The book itself looks more at healthy pastors and looks more at issues that face the pastors, like loneliness and depression and the sense of being overwhelmed and bureaucratic challenges. Yeah.
And is it fair to say that when we talk about pastors, everybody has an image in their mind, and maybe they're thinking about their current pastor, maybe they're thinking about a bad experience they've had in the past, maybe they're thinking of the ideal and perfect pastor and what they're supposed to look like, but I guess all pastors start off young and they grow in maturity, and so pastors are on a journey just like everyone, and you get young pastors who are growing to maturity and hopefully getting better as they go. Is that a way of putting context around where you might be assessing your own pastor?
Well, look, I think that's a really good observation. Pastors can come in young, but also pastors can come in at 34 or at 50. Pastors can come in older. Pastors can be male or female, depending on your theological focus and your ministry expression. The book itself, Healthy Pastors, Thriving Churches, in terms of sustaining a healthy foundation for a lifetime of kingdom impact, the book itself looks at pastors across about 20 different countries. So I've had the privilege to serve in different countries, and so I've heard back from collaborators in rural India and urban India, in northeast Thailand, in Cambodia, in many other, in US, in many other countries, looking at the needs of pastors. But particularly, specifically within Australia, look, pastors learn along the way. They make mistakes, they do great things, they need encouragement.
And interesting to reflect on the difference between those pastors, as you say, in that Asian context. And you've got a wonderful missionary history working with India and on lots of mission boards, looking after people and pastors who are in about 12 different countries, I think it is. So is there something unique for Australian pastors? I mean, there's lots of red tape, there's rules and regulations, the administrative load on Australia. Now, I'm assuming they don't have the same administrative load in lots of developing countries, but how do you reflect on Aussie pastors?
Yeah, look, so spot on, Neil, to pick up on the bureaucratic challenges that pastors are facing. Many of them are saying there are so many things that they have to deal with from a bureaucratic perspective. One pastor, I was just talking with his denominational leader, and the denominational leader was saying, I have pastors crying now because they're facing so many bureaucratic challenges. Literally, he had a pastor in his office that was crying because of the bureaucratic challenges that he needed to face and to deal with. Now, whereas I could flip to the fact of pastors in rural regions in northeast Thailand or even in US, I could flip to pastors in Europe or in the Middle East or in Kazakhstan or something like that, and they have different needs. Pastors in India, for instance, in some parts of India, they'll have their churches burnt down. They'll sometimes have the pastors beaten, and very sadly, sometimes the pastors are killed. And then the denominational leaders need to support the families. So we have such a breadth of challenge for pastors around the world.
Well, that gives us a wonderful context because if you're a pastor and your church building has just been burnt down and you're being threatened by an angry mob, perhaps you've been beaten and perhaps you've been arrested, perhaps you've stood before tribunals and courts, and you're back to stand up again in front of your congregation and saying, I'm here for more. You want to hope that your pastor is going to be able to, in those moments, survive, because not all pastors are like Superman. able to jump tall buildings in a single bound. Pastors are just like you and I, and so there are sorts of vulnerabilities in there. And this is where I think you come in, and some of the wonderful things that you've been writing about in your book, the emotional health of the pastor, the physical health of the pastor, the spiritual health of the pastor. We've all got a responsibility to help our pastors thrive so that our church can thrive. Is that the way that it works?
Oh, look, so good, Neil. I really appreciate your insights, and that is what I'm working on. I'm working on especially emotional health with pastors, because that's often a hidden one that pastors either don't acknowledge or they don't open up and share about. Also, I would say to the people within the congregations, and this would be a plea to the people within the congregations, love your pastor, treasure your pastor, encourage your pastor. Sure, you'll have things you want to tell your pastor and things you want your pastor to help you with and maybe pray for you and provide for your needs, but recognize that they're human. They need encouragement. If you encourage your pastor's going to do a better job. And so pastors need encouragement. In fact, I have to say, as I've worked with pastors and looked across surveys, and people have done surveys for 5 million pastors across 20 different countries, here are the very brief overview of the statistics. There's a quarter of the pastors that are thriving and doing well. There's a quarter of the pastors that are just surviving. There's a quarter of the pastors that are not surviving and wanting to give up. And then there's a quarter of the pastors that are burning out. And I've talked with pastors that they have so much stress. I just talked with a former pastor a few days ago, so much stress in their shoulders and in their throat, so much stress that they literally cannot speak. So you and I are speaking, Neil, our vocal cords are working. This man, he spoke to me about it. He's since recovered 12 years later. His vocal cords work now, but his vocal cords did not work because of the stress and the burnout of being a pastor. Love your pastor. I say to the people, love your pastor.
And as you say, and I think a key here, your encouragement is going to help your pastor to thrive. And for some, where criticism is their main way of communicating about their pastor, that might be a good area to actually maybe draw back a little bit on and assess how you talk about your pastor, because there's going to be lots of things to criticise about every pastor. But sometimes holding your tongue and not being a critic but being the encourager is actually going to help your church grow and thrive. I mean, that's just a wonderful and profound bit of wisdom that you've just led us to. And I want to invite listeners to join into our conversation today. You might like to contribute, and it might even be around unhealthy church. If you're mentioning any pastors, I don't want you to tell me their name, or I don't want to even hear denominations, but you might like to contribute. So our talkback line is open on 1-800-316-316. 1-800-316-316. Our special guest is the Reverend Dr. Brian Birkett, and he's just released his latest book. It's called Healthy Pastors, Thriving Churches, Practical Principles to Fruitful Ministry for a Lifetime. And this is all about you in the church that you're a part of and the pastor that you might be supporting. 1-800-316-316. We're back with more in a short few moments.
If you have primary school aged kids or grandkids, make sure Vision Kids is part of their daily routine.
Vision Kids!
Vision Kids is a 24/7 online radio stream featuring the ever-popular Adventures in Odyssey.
Hi, this is Chris. Welcome to Adventures in Odyssey.
Plus other world-class radio dramas, kids' music, and friendly voices.
G'day, Vision Kids!
Vision Kids is streaming now in the Vision app and online at visionkids.org.au. You can also tell your smart speakers to play Vision Kids Radio. If you don't already have the Vision app on your phone or tablet, you can download it for free when you search Vision Christian Media in your app store. Vision Kids. Another way we're helping the whole family look to God daily.
It takes a big family to keep Vision on the air across Australia. Individuals, churches and businesses. like Everett Butchers. Shop 14 at the Woolworths Complex, Kalgoorlie Central.
This is 2020 with Neil Johnson, helping you make sense of life, culture and current events from a biblical perspective. 2020 on Vision Christian Radio.
I was a child of wrath, an enemy of the King of Peace. But love was stronger, love was stronger. I tried resisting grace, the Son of God still took my place. 'Cause love was stronger, love was stronger. You are stronger than my sins you carry to the cross with resurrecting love. Love was stronger. Love was stronger. Love was stronger. Love was stronger. When you had called me in, my flesh was weak, my heart was dead. But love was stronger, love was stronger. I was in a foreign land, you made me a citizen in you. 'Cause love was stronger, love was stronger. You are stronger than my sins you carry to the cross with resurrecting love. Love was stronger. Love was stronger. Love was stronger. Love was stronger.
It's audio adrenaline. Love was stronger. You're on Vision. It's Neil with you. It is the Tuesday edition of 2020. Our special guest this hour is the Reverend Dr. Brian Birkett. He's released a book called Healthy Pastors, Thriving Churches, Sustaining a Healthy Personal Foundation for a Lifetime of Kingdom Impact. Hey, Brian, when we talk about the title of your book, I can't help but reflect on the Apostle Paul, faithful to the end, fighting the good fight, running the race, keeping the faith. There's something there, I think, with pastors. This is what you do. You're trying to sustain a pastor for a lifelong of service, not seeing someone burned out and thrown onto the rubbish heap. Is that a fair enough way of thinking about how you think about pastors and maturity and a lifetime of service?
Oh, so true, Neil. Knowing, as I mentioned earlier, that 3/4 of pastors end up facing challenges and discouragement, and only about a quarter thrive at any one time. We can look at Paul and we can say, look, he faced so many challenges. He faced shipwreck, he faced beatings, he faced imprisonment, he faced isolation, he faced no friends there to support him. He faced all of those things. Pastors face some of those things. They feel isolation. I've spoken with a pastor recently, board challenges, division in the church, feeling burnt out, wondering whether his mental health and emotional health will sustain him to be able to recover, taking time out at the moment. I believe God's hand reaches out to people like that. God's Spirit wants to encourage them. And that's part of what we do with Springboard Consulting. That's part of what others do that work in a similar space as myself. I'm so thrilled to see many coming alongside pastors. But we can look at Paul and we can say, Paul said in 2 Timothy 2 and then 2 Timothy 4, he speaks in 2 Timothy 2 to Timothy to multiply many faithful and reliable workers. In 2 Timothy 4, verse 6 to 8, he says, as you've quoted, that he fought the good fight, he's finished the race, and he's ready, as it says in Corinthians as well, to win the prize in Christ Jesus that is prepared for. That's my prayer for pastors. That's my prayer for myself. Neil, that's my prayer for you and for every listener, that we would walk in discipleship and follow and love Jesus until the end of our days, until we head into heaven.
And this is the way that church grows, isn't it? Because you've got someone in maturity, let's call them the pastor, passing on in the presence of many witnesses, entrusting those things to reliable people, not just someone who's designated to be a pastor. Not everybody is like that, as you say. Some come in midlife and change complete direction altogether. But these reliable people that the wisdom is passed on to, if your pastor is missing some ingredients or struggling under the weight of stress, they're not going to be able to do that effectively. So you want to be able to make that happen wherever you are in church life, in whatever position you might be. Just be the support and the encourager of that pastor.
Yes. Look, so true. What I've come to see as the years have gone by is the power of the board, or some churches call it the oversight team, some churches call it the leadership team, some call it the board of elders, all sorts of governance titles around the top team that help lead the church. They're the ones organisationally that can support the pastor. And then, of course, the pastor will often have a leadership team, whether it's a large church or a small church, they'll have a leadership team around them. I've said to pastors, because I mostly work with pastors, I sometimes work with boards and with elders, I sometimes work with leadership teams, but I've said to pastors, build a good leadership team, build a good organisational board of elders, and if you don't have one, work towards creating one. So I say to all involved, to the leadership team, to the board of elders, to the oversight team, get behind your pastors, support your pastors. And I'll give you this one for free, so to speak, Neil. Yep. If your pastor's not doing well, and if your pastor's really making a botched up effort of it, get someone to come in alongside them and to try to help them. And if they're starting to get, crazy ideas, challenge them, but don't do it publicly. Don't cause division. So yeah, there's some of the things facing us.
I think you mention the things that happen insofar as the support that comes, because if you're a part of a denominational church, there's probably a layer of leadership above your pastor, and there might even be another layer above that. But there's someone to call on, someone who's in some sense in charge of that encouragement, in charge of helping the pastor and nurtured on to being really effective. But if you're outside of a denominational structure, sometimes you're going to be without that sort of support. Is that the way it works? Is there real value in being a denominational pastor?
Oh, look, that's very much how it works. And sometimes there's wonderful value of being a denominational pastor, and sometimes it's a disaster. It depends on the denomination, and it depends on the way the denomination cares for the pastors or leads the pastors or supports the pastors. It depends on the structure of how they do church, the pastors and the church itself, how it does church, whether it's egalitarian, which would be everyone kind of come alongside one another, whether it's hierarchical, which is kind of like the dictator. And some say the best is the benevolent dictator, someone that comes alongside, but also for the benefit of others, but also leads strongly. I'm not so sure about that. I like someone that takes people on team collaboratively and genuinely collaboratively. I've seen churches that are pseudo-collaborative. And so look, denominational teams and structures can be magnificent. I've dealt with many denominational leaders in Australia, probably about 12 denominational leaders in Australia. I've dealt with about 30 denominational leaders, 40 denominational leaders across the world. And there's structures and denominational leaders, they're magnificent. And they're awful, and they're dreadful, and I wish they would move aside. So there's both, Neil. There's both.
And isn't this an important element? Because there's strengths and weaknesses to whatever form of governance you might have in your local church. Ultimately, there's a long-term view, isn't there? That somehow or other there'll be a baton passed on to a new leader, And as congregation grows up, you've got children moving into those adult forms of leadership, and then you've got their children again coming through. So if you want to sustain something long term, you've either got to choose some sort of congregational governance or some sort of Presbyterian. That'd be the two sort of ones people often talk about. Presbyterian or congregational governance, they both have their strengths and both have their weaknesses. So I guess you work with the strengths in the one that you're in.
Yes. Look, that's the best thing, is enhance the strengths and minimise the weaknesses, and work within the structure, because constitutionally you can't change the way governance is done. Not if you stay in the same denomination. So work with the strengths and minimise the weaknesses.
Brian, let's talk about generational changes. I mean, there's a lot of people who are in churches, demographics, people are growing older. In some of those, you've got pastors growing older. In a conversation just before ours, we were talking about some changes in church life in the Anglican Church, and more specifically around Sydney. And the fact that while some churches are folding, others are merging. And then when they're merging, there's opportunity for renewal. So when you're talking about generational changes, as you do have to talk about, because you've got the church it's going to thrive and survive much longer than we're all alive. We want the church to be continuing on. Transitions from an older leader to a younger one. Is this one of the challenges you like to deal with?
Oh, look, so true. It's such a challenge, really, because some of the older leaders hang on because they say, well, look, when I started as a pastor, there was no superannuation. So how am I going to myself? Financial security, and also how do I have significance, because pastors have learnt and earned significance over the 30 or 40 years that they've been leading. And if they give up leadership as an older pastor, what do? Who are they? Where do they go? Which church do they attend? So that's some of the challenges of the older pastors. And I've seen and know in some particular denominations, many of the older guard hold on because of some of those issues. And then also there's the challenge of younger ones coming in. Sometimes the younger ones, as pastors, they are young guns. You know the expression, young guns. They think they know everything. They're in their 20s and they're going to change the world. They hit their 30s and they realise the world's bigger than they thought it was. They hit their 40s and maybe they hit some disillusionment. We need to help them through their 20s, 30s and 40s, and we need to develop them, because the church has been going a lot longer than you and I, Neil, and it's been going a lot longer than the listeners, and we need the church to continue for generations and to see ongoing kingdom impact. I mustn't start preaching, Neil, but I'm feeling passionate about this area of healthy transitions for generations.
You know, as you're sharing those things, Brian, I'm thinking of some pastors that I know, and I'm just reflecting on the fact that, in my denominational background, not everybody came into pastoral leadership on a salary that was going to keep them nicely. And as you mentioned, sometimes pastors in their earlier years had no superannuation, and their retirement prospects look fairly grim. There's a lot of sacrifices that have happened for a lot of those senior pastors, and that's not always appreciated, because very rare does anybody as a starter come in on a six-figure salary. It just doesn't happen, does it? No, it's so true. Sometimes they come in on the smell of an oily rag, as the old saying would be. And sometimes it's a day a week. Sometimes they work 3 days a week and get paid 1 day. Sometimes they're bivocational. Sometimes they work 5 or 6 days a week and they get paid 3 days. It's a challenge. Pay our pastors properly. Pay our pastors something similar to what teachers are being paid. That's a good guideline. And so for board members and organisational leaders, I think we need to look at the pay. We need to look at the superannuation. We need to look at the transition for older pastors. But also we need to look at helping older pastors not hanging on just because, well, that's what they've done all their lives and they want to stay there and they're not going to make room for someone else who's that young
young whippersnapper that's 45 that's telling me as a 75-year-old how to do something. Come on, move over. Let someone through and release the reins. Yeah.
Hey, I love what you're saying there, and it probably is a whole other conversation for another day on how much pastors get paid, because it's probably there's probably a little bit of an illusion there that pastors are being paid a lot, and no doubt there'll be some who will be saying, well, isn't there a rich list of some televangelist pastors? And there are, but the majority of pastors in the majority of churches are probably, as you say, surviving on the smell of an oily rag. Hey, I want to get into some of these domains. You like to talk about 6 domains for pastoral health, and what we all might as congregational members be on the lookout for in our own church setting. But before we do, let's take a call. Carol is in New South Wales, and our talkback line's open on 1800 316 316. Carol, welcome along.
Thank you, Neil. May I speak to Brian, please?
Absolutely, he can hear you. What are your thoughts?
Thank you. I would like to know, I mean, I'm heading on 74 and that, but we've got a good minister. He's in his 40s, and I would like to know how to encourage him. It's the reverse of the husband and wife. You know, the wife, I had a good husband, I didn't have to do this, but, you know, you have to let the husband know what you're thinking, you know. So I want to know how to encourage a good pastor. What does he need to hear from me?
Brian, over to you.
Oh, Carol, that's such a beautiful question. I'm guessing, Carol, that you're already encouraging him if you're asking that question, because you're already appreciating him. Specifically, what I'd be doing is you could write him a note. Just a brief note, one paragraph of something specific that you appreciate about him. That could be in written paper form, that could be in email form, just something that he did on Sunday. It might be, hey, you saw him wash the dishes. Hey, you saw him welcome a new person. Oh, it was a powerful message and really touched your heart because of this, this, and this. So something specific, something verbal, and that's written, but then verbally it would be going up to him and just shaking his hand, not taking too long, but just briefly saying, I really appreciate you, Bill or Bob or Ben or whatever his name is. I really appreciate you, Pastor, however you call him. That'd be things I would suggest, Carol. And who knows, if you're a baker, my wife's just made this hummingbird cake that I can smell at my place. We're going to have it at our life group tonight, where I'm a pastor. I've overseen thousands, really, but I'm in a small group of 15 people, and we'll take a hummingbird cake along and we'll enjoy it. You might bake, Carol. There's a few ideas. Does that help?
Oh, excellent. And then I thought also, too, you know, he wasn't very well. He had the flu, but I thought that he wasn't taking enough time to rest because he's got, you know, nursing home thing and so on and so forth as well. And he was pretty sick. So what could I say to him? What could I say to him, like, if he's really crook, to take a little bit of time off? He's not, I suppose the people in the church are small, but they're a nice group. So, you know, I don't want him to burn out because he's got 6 children.
Good on you. Good on you. Well, I think you're golden, Carol. If you were in my church, I'm not that I'm a senior pastor, but if you were in my church, I'd be so thrilled. So great question. I think encourage him to rest. Say to him, don't burn out. Say to him, take time with your family.
So, Carol is just saying, encourage him to rest. Encourage him to not burn out. Yes. Sorry, I thought you could hear.
Yes. Yes. And just encourage him to mobilise others to do some of the work. So it may be others that need to go to the nursing home, others that can pick up responsibilities so that he can recover. But not only when he's sick, but so that he can pace himself for ministry. So affirmation, but also wise guidance. You said you're older, so wise guidance, like a mother would give guidance to a son to say, hey, rest, Bill, Bob, Ben, whatever your name is, rest.
Carol, thank you so much. Great insight in those observations that you've made. Great questions. Carol in New South Wales, thank you so much for your call. Our talkback line is open on 1800 316 316. Just before we move on, and interesting as Carol was reflecting on her pastor who's got 6 kids. That takes a lot of work itself. The workload, the work day of a pastor is a little different to whether you're out digging trenches or building houses. The sort of responsibilities that you have as a pastor, a lot of that is role modelling, having the way that your family develops, a faith-filled family, and the expressions of community. You want your pastor to have a strong marriage and a strong family, and if your pastor's got 6 kids, there's got to be a little allowance in there, hasn't there? How does that work with, with the pastor's work day?
Yeah, look, that's such a big society, isn't it? Talking about working from home. We're not going to get into that, I know, Neil, but talking about balance within life, it's so important for pastors as well. So I say to pastors, Sunday is going to be a busy day. After Sunday, rest with your family. Work Monday. Hear that? Work Monday, pastors. Many pastors take Monday off. They're exhausted. Archibald Hart was one of my professors. He was a neuropsychologist. He's written many good books. One is The Hidden Link Between Adrenaline and Stress. He oversaw the American Counselors Association, 10,000 counsellors. So he was a professor at Fuller Theological Seminary where I was studying. And Archibald Hart would say, pastors who on a Monday take time to be with their families, they're often mini-depressed. Here's what happens. They have an adrenaline spike and high because people say to them, that was a beautiful sermon. Thank you for your wonderful input into our lives. You're so beautiful, or whatever. And they shake their hand and encourage them. On a Monday, they're by themselves and they think, oh, I said that wrong. Gloria didn't greet me. Oh, there's not enough money coming in. Jenny and Bob were mad at me. Oh, I feel so bad. They get this this mini depression. The challenge that Archibald gives is give that mini depression back to the church. That's where it came from. Don't give it to your wife. Don't give it to your family. Take a Thursday off. That's what Arch suggests, a Wednesday or a Thursday, because Friday you've got to prepare for church and stuff. So work-life balance. Yeah.
Very powerful. Hey, let's get into some discussion here, because we're into some good practical things today about healthy pastors and thriving churches. So if we're talking about healthy pastors, we could talk about physical health, mental health, emotional health. I know you love to talk about even spiritual health. In fact, you've identified 6 key dimensions or domains about the health of the leader, the pastor. Let's go through those quickly and then we pick up on a few.
Yeah, look, I love it, Neil. You picked up on 4 of them yourself, and you're not teaching it. Maybe you need to come and join me. So social is one, and that is that there's healthy relationships for the pastor. See, when I'm going through these domains, though, this can apply to any person in the church. I'm speaking to the people in the church now. Are you in healthy social relationships? Not how many social media followers you've got, but people that would come to see you if you were feeling sick or down or whatever else. So there's the social. There's the physical. This applies to everyone, especially to pastors. Many pastors are overweight. Many pastors are exhausted. Many pastors don't sleep well because they're worrying about their congregations. So there's sleep, there's exercise, there's diet, there's food, there's intimacy. How do we handle those areas in our physical world? The financial world, that's one that trips up pastors so often. So in my book, Healthy Pastors, Thriving Churches, we look at the financial world and how to have a contentment in financial approaches. Then we also look at the mental world. So mental world would be things like depression, anxiety, even some of the bigger ones like schizophrenia and paranoia and psychosis. They're some of the big areas. Plus lifelong learning. Then the fifth one, you're right, is emotional health. We look at emotional health in depth, and I look at 3 key ingredients that came from interviewing over 1,000 people, 3 key ingredients and over 200 books, 100 Bible verses. My research found 3 key ingredients to be an emotionally healthy disciple, which is also an emotionally healthy pastor. And then finally, we would look at the spiritual domain. Now, that's often the one that we look at the most. Are you reading your Bible? Are you praying? Are you worshiping? And are you in community? But I say, don't just look at it like that. Are you taking time to be in God's Word in a meaningful way? Not are you reading your Bible? Are you taking time to listen to God as well as to share with God the things that you may have on your heart and needs, etc.? So they're the things that I look at for a healthy personal foundation for a lifetime.
So if you're a congregation member and you're interested in the spiritual life of your pastor. Now, this is interesting because most of us might think as a congregation member, someone who turns up at church on Sunday, that the pastor's already there firing on all cylinders spiritually. And I suspect if I dug a little bit deeper, I would hear from you, as would be the obvious. Not every pastor turns up at church on Sunday and they're firing on all cylinders. So somehow or other, the encouragement for the pastor to have a deeper, intimate and spiritual time with God, that has to be a part of where we all play a role as well.
Oh, look, so vital for our pastors. I've had pastors say to me, after leading a significant prayer meeting with a large group of people publicly that was magnificently done, I've gone up to them and I've said, that was a fabulous prayer meeting. And they said, yes, but if only my personal prayer was as good as that. And then I've talked with pastors and they say, I'm only reading the Bible to prepare for my next sermon. I'm not taking time to read the Bible for myself, to grow myself. And then other pastors that are struggling because God's not answering their prayers, or he's not providing for their finances, or they're having difficulty with one of their children and they can't work out where God is. So in their spiritual lives, I work with many pastors to help them to come alive spiritually, to find that place of intimacy with God again. We use spiritual disciplines. Through my book, I talk about spiritual disciplines, which are things like silence and solitude and Sabbath, things like fasting and taking time for prayer and taking time to listen to God. So yes, congregational members, encourage your pastors. Tell them you love them. Tell them you appreciate them. Affirm them specifically. Listen to their needs and pray for them and say, hey, pastor, whatever their name might be. Or you may call them reverend, or you may call them brother, or you may call them sister. I don't know. But for your pastor, when you speak with them, however you greet them, say, how can I pray for you and your family, pastor? Oh, after they've fallen over with shock that you're asking how they're going, just take some time to listen and take some time to encourage them.
You know, Brian, when you're the mentor of a pastor in a church and you recognise that they've got their hands full with a lot of red tape and regulations and all those sorts of things, separating the professional responsibility that you have to have leading a church today to the calling that you rose to and prepared for, and you moved into serving God, professional responsibility versus this service and calling that you might be responding to. How do you balance those? How do you encourage the pastor to go according to their calling, but also maintain these other professional responsibilities?
Well, I think there's an image that might help us understand that. It might be the person in the circus that is spinning plates, and there's plates spinning, and then they add other plates spinning, and they're using their two hands to spin their plates, and then they put their foot up to use their foot to spin plates, and then their other foot up to spin plates. They're sitting on their bum, and they're spinning the plates with their four appendages to try and keep things going, and then suddenly something gets added. What do they do? So pastors are facing those sorts of situations. So I say a wise pastor, when they have 12 people, if they're planting a church, that goes to 30 people. And the average church in Australia is between 48 and 52. And that's because pastors aren't able to raise up new leaders and to give responsibility to others. That's one of the main reasons. So I say, pastors, give responsibilities to others. Hand over plates to others.
So many people might be thinking, well, I'd do more in church if somebody asked me. The pastor's not always getting people to put their hand up. But there might be an opportunity for listeners today in their own local church setting to be on the lookout for things that may be looking like loose ends, need some attention. But we could get into that in a deeper way, but come back to your plate spinning illustration. Everything's working all at once. The fact is,
yes,
some of those plates drop to the ground and shatter.
Yes.
Sometimes it's people. Sometimes it's congregational members with illness and they die. Sometimes there are people who are going through all sorts of things. The pastor's carrying a lot of the burden of people's lives on their shoulders, and that's what a lot of that plate spinning is in a pastoral sense. Pastors dealing with a lot of grief. They might not actually call it that, but some of that grief is an important element that congregational members are not so aware of when some of the plates drop to the ground. How do you reflect on that?
Grief is exponential in its impact when there's ongoing grief. I had one pastor in Ethiopia, so in Africa, and he said, he contacted me. He was starting to lead a denomination. He planted a church. I was across with him when he was there with a team of 6 other people, and he and his wife. His church had become 21 churches, 21. So he created a denomination of thousands of people about 10 years later. And he said to me, he calls me Pastor Brian. He said to me, Pastor Brian, what do? I keep having to go to funerals. And I said, well, tell me some more. And he said, well, people are dying from each of our communities, and we have to have a funeral for 3 days, and I'm expected to be there. I said, that's not good. But he was experiencing compound grief. We call it compound grief when you're having to deal with different people dying from different communities. So I guided him to drop into some of those funerals and to get others to manage other funerals and to be allowing others to be in charge of those. But we need to come alongside pastors when they're facing those challenges, and they need someone to listen to them and to counsel them and to care for them.
It's an old saying about pastors. They hatch 'em, match 'em, and dispatch 'em. And the grief that comes along with the love that you have for congregational members, or the grief that comes along when you've matched someone and they're going through such problems that their marriage is disintegrating and it ends in divorce. There's a lot of challenges. Sometimes there are wins and sometimes there are losses, losses, and there's a real opportunity for listeners today, perhaps to be thinking about healthy pastors and thriving churches, because Brian Birkett, his latest book is called is Healthy Pastors, Thriving Churches, Sustaining a Healthy Personal Foundation for a Lifetime of Kingdom Impact. You might be listening to us today thinking, maybe I'll buy this book as a gift for my pastor. Hoping that I don't, just share a message, hey, you're not doing a good job, so I bought you this book. But I'm sure that there'll be a lot of pastors who might like to get a hold of it. It's a new book, and its author is Reverend Dr. Brian Birkett. Brian works in a consultancy role. He's the founder of Springboard Consulting and you can find springboardconsulting.com.au. Brian, I also want to mention that for listeners who are thinking about your book today, Healthy Pastors, Thriving Churches, that on your website, springboardconsulting.com.au, there's a link there where listeners can actually read that first chapter, and that might just be the thing that sparks them to maybe getting a hold of this book. So the encouragement is there, springboardconsulting.com.au/book, to be able to read for free the first chapter of that book, and then you might even be inspired to get a copy of that for your pastor. Brian Birkett, great getting your insights today. Thank you so much for taking some time to share your thoughts and your heart with listeners today on 2020.
Such a privilege, Neil. And yes, that book's for board members, members in the congregation, leaders in the congregation, as well as their pastors, as well as Bible colleges. So, but it's been such a beautiful time to be able to share with you. I love your heart, Neil, for the Christian community. So I just want to encourage you. Is that all right?
You can encourage
in
me.
10 seconds. I just want to say thank you for your heart for Christian leaders. Thank you for your heart for Christian communities. Thank you for your heart for the wider body of Christ and the way you do that so beautifully. So thanks for the opportunity to serve and to share with you today.
Well, I'll humbly receive that compliment. Brian Birkett, we'll talk again another day soon, sooner than the last time we spoke. I think it's about 7 years since we spoke last, but
Yes, well.
I'll look
Yes,
forward to
well.
talking to you again sometime very soon. Dr. Brian Birkett.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.